The Daily Signal is coming to you live from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and we are joined now by Chuck DeVore, an old friend who is now leading national initiatives for the Texas Public Policy Foundation, an organization that works very closely with the Heritage Foundation on a national level, and, I might add, Kevin Roberts, formerly of TPPF,
That's
so
right.
so we share that connection.
And I'm sure you meant longtime friend, not old friend. But
That's right.
I'll forgive you for that one.
Chuck and I go way back to when I was at Human Events, and
Yes.
you were an assemblyman from
Yes.
California,
Yes.
and regularly writing to us about the crazy things that were going on in that state.
It was always, I was never at a loss for pieces back then. Yeah.
That is so true. That is so true. I imagine things are much better in Texas.
They are. My views that I had in California that were extreme are now mainstream. So yeah.
That's right. That's right.
Good.
Well, let's start. Let's talk about so obviously Texas Public Policy Foundation has its roots in Austin and focusing on a lot of the things that are happening at the state level, but you've seen an opportunity to expand and
Right.
have more of a national impact. So tell us about some of the things that are going on in your world.
Well, that's a great question. We have a lot of activity going on in the rest of the country. I'll start with something that predated my time or my tenure as the Chief National Initiatives Officer, and it's our public interest law firm. We have 8 attorneys backed by 2 paralegals, and we sue the federal government over basic constitutional issues. And it's fun as heck. Occasionally we sue cities that get out of line, local governments, but we always try to find a nexus to an overriding constitutional principle to try to restore the initial understanding of the Constitution and kind of push back against, things like dormant commerce clause or even Chevron cases. Of course, we saw the big Chevron case a couple of months ago. So that's real fun. We have a new effort called the National Center for Energy Analytics, and that's led by Mark Mills. That effort has really grown quickly. We have 10 people working on that. It's physics and energy economics and chemistry and the grid. And what we're doing is we're researching really the nuts and bolts of the use of energy, the supply of energy. Our inaugural paper was about the lack of forethought that went into the EV mandate and the trillions of dollars worth of electrical transformers that are needed to power the EV economy. No one thought of this. I mean, setting aside the additional electricity you need, how do you even get the electricity to the EVs if the local neighborhood transformers can't handle it? Well, there's a price tag to that, and it's well over $1 trillion. So that was our first paper that was released in the last month. We also have Right on Crime, which is led by Brett Tolman, a former U.S. attorney for Utah. That's got about 17 people around the country, and what we're trying to do is apply lessons learned, mostly from Texas, but other states, where we can improve public safety and do so cost effectively. And so that's a very important effort. Another new effort is our Election Protection Project, and that's led by Joshua Finley. We've got, I think now, 7 people working for Joshua around the country, and what we're trying to do is encourage local voting jurisdictions to actually follow the state election code and to follow the regulations and best practices and just make sure that every proper vote is properly counted and those that aren't eligible aren't to be counted. And we have other efforts as well. We work on issues south of the border, looking at the corruption in Mexico. We look at state relations. In other words, how can states apply some of these lessons learned that we've developed in Texas? Here, let us help you with some of these reforms. And we have an office in D.C. as well. So a lot of different activities out there, and it's really fun to try to help coordinate this fairly big effort.
Well, thank you for sharing that perspective. Just an incredible amount of work that you're doing. I'd like to start by focusing on the aspect of the legal side of things, because it's so important, I think, for conservatives to be engaged in that arena. Certainly, we can't see that ground to the left, which has used the courts, right, to achieve a lot of its ends. So walk us through some of the wins that you've had in the legal space and what's coming up in the future.
Yeah. So one of the early wins had to do with Obamacare and had to do with, as I recall, the individual mandate. And of course, once that's unhinged, it starts to unhinge, a few other things. Another interesting case has to do with the attempt by the Bureau of Land Management, the other BLM, to seize some, I think it was close to 80,000 acres on the Texas-Oklahoma border where the Red River over the last 100 years had meandered. And the federal government was trying to take this creative interpretation under Obama that said as the river meandered, any of the land that ended up stranded on the other side of the meander belonged to the federal government. And so you had these ranches in Texas that had been paying property taxes, that had been working the land. The Red River had kind of changed its course, and now the parts of their property were north of the Red River, but they still owned it, they thought, right? So the federal government was trying to say, no, that's actually ours. So we were prevailing in the appeals court, and then the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, took over and dropped the case, right? We were kind of hoping it would go to completion. Another fascinating case has to do with property rights. There was a case, I think it was up in Michigan, where a family had a Christmas tree farm in a city that had a tree ordinance that said you can't cut trees down. Well, this is a Christmas tree farm, right? And so they were fining the family all this money for the trees that they were cutting down. Then they started to fine them for not complying with the order. They contacted us, and we came alongside and represented them. And then eventually we found retaliation. We actually had proof that the city bureaucrats were maliciously retaliating against the family, and we were able to, it's a very rare win, prove this retaliation. So we prevailed in that case. Very important case from the standpoint of property rights and the relationship between property owners and their government.
You brought up the topic of election integrity earlier and the important work you're doing in that area. You know, I've talked to individuals, including some folks from Texas, who said, you know, we shouldn't be just assuming that because we don't have a pandemic or a national emergency like we did in 2020, that things are just going to go back to normal. Right. Conservatives and all Americans, frankly, need to be vigilant about election laws and make sure that they're followed in 2024. So are there efforts that you're specifically want to point our viewers to where they should be paying attention, or states where maybe there needs to be a little bit more scrutiny than there currently is?
Right. So one of the projects we're working on, and we're doing in states other than Nevada, but we've really focused on Nevada because they've really gone toward an all mail-in election. And so what we've done, because Nevada residents have a lot of, they're transients, right? It's the nature of the casino industry. They come in, they may work a year or two, then they leave. And so what we've done is we've taken data that we've developed, and we've looked at people that we suspect are no longer living in a specific location, or we know have moved out of that location, and we send them an envelope to the people, for example, that live in the location we know they've left, saying, hey, resident of this address, does Joe Smith still live here? And if he doesn't, fill out this form and send it in. And conversely, if we know the person's moved out of state but is still registered in Nevada, we send a letter out of state, and we have the same sort of thing. Well, under Nevada law, if you have this signed postcard that says, you know, I no longer live at this address, they're supposed to move your voter registration to inactive. Well, we've sent out thousands and thousands of letters, and we were a little skeptical at first. You know, we knew that there was a lot of deadwood, but we didn't know how much, and nor did we know whether people would respond. And the last I checked with the people who are running this, that work under my direction, over 6% returned saying, yeah, I don't live here anymore, or Joe doesn't live at this address anymore. Now, why is that important? During the election, you'll have live ballots sent to these addresses where these individuals don't live. And in some apartment complexes around election time, you see these ballots stack up in the waste bins or on the ground. Right? These are live ballots. Now, you twin that with the fact that in 2020, Nevada essentially ceased doing signature verification. So, you know, a crayoned X would be sufficient to pass, right? And so you have all these live ballots, tens of thousands of live ballots sitting around, and you combine that with no signature verification. Well, okay, pardon me if I think that maybe some of these ballots might be converted into votes. And so we're tackling that with this initiative. Now, from a practical standpoint, let me suggest 3 things that your viewers can do. Number 1, if you're an attorney, well, see what you can do to volunteer and to help out with any sort of legal support as far as lawsuits that might be needed. Any sort of lawsuits regarding problems that are seen early need to be filed well before the election. You can't wait around. If you see problems happening, you have to sue to try to force compliance with election code or with the regulations. The second thing and the third thing together, become a trained election worker or a trained poll watcher. Most states require a certain minimal amount of training. It's not that difficult, and you have to get registered. If you have voted in person any time in the last few years, you'll note that the people working the polls seem to be getting older and older and older, and there's often fewer of them. And the problem is, in some jurisdictions, let's say Philadelphia, by law, there has to be the availability of room for a Republican observer. But in many of these precincts, there are none because nobody bothers to get trained, nor do they go. And that is a huge oversight because if you only have members of one party present, I don't care whether it's Republican or Democrat, then the temptation is that nobody's watching and maybe some corner cutting will happen. And that's not as likely to happen if you have representatives who are both working the polls as poll workers as well as watching the polls as poll watchers. We need tens of thousands of people to do that.
Absolutely. So critical. Great advice. I think that our viewers should take it to heart and look for those opportunities in their local communities to do that. And I'm glad you pointed out the example of Nevada specifically because that is a state where you had a U.S. Senate race and governor's race decided by thousands of votes. I mean, so in many of these states and jurisdictions, the margin of victory is not that much. And, that stack of votes that you talked about at the apartment complex could be the determining factor.
Absolutely. That's why you have to make sure that it's smaller.
That's right. One more question for you, Chuck. You talked earlier about, you've referenced, if not in your own words, the administrative state and the growth of power in Washington, D.C.,
Right.
But it's so important, and we talk about this all the time, about how we look to states and localities to really make more of the decisions as it affects, our lives. What are some of the things you referenced earlier in terms of models that states can maybe share with other states so that the federal government doesn't necessarily encroach on our lives the way it has?
Wow. Okay, so, that's an interesting question because on one hand, some of it presupposes that the states are actually asserting their state powers. And by the way, notice I said powers and not rights, because governments don't have rights, do they? Only people have rights. Governments have powers. And so with power, as it is with a lot of analogous things, if you don't use it, it atrophies. And so one, I think, really good example that you're seeing right now is Texas Governor Greg Abbott and the power that he is asserting on the border with Mexico to preserve the health and safety of Texas citizens, Texas residents. Texas is spending some $2 billion a year of its own money to put additional National Guard on the border, the Texas state troopers called the Department of Public Safety, building barriers and doing what they can to preserve the peace and the tranquility of Texans from being interrupted by these criminal gangs from Mexico and hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants. And as a result, you've seen a lot of that power, a lot of those illegal immigrants go to the West. They've gone to California, they're going to Arizona, to a lesser degree New Mexico, where you have Democratic governors who are far more favorable to the concept of illegal immigration. Well, there's an interesting example, right, where the state of Texas under Greg Abbott saw a vacuum, they saw a failure of federal policy, and they moved in with confidence, very deliberatively, to essentially challenge the federal surrender at the border. And so far, so good, right? You're seeing Texas win these legal rulings, and they're still down there doing this, right? A lot of people didn't think that this was going to happen. So that's one interesting example, I think, of states directly pushing back. Another, when it comes to the bureaucracy, is a little more difficult to look at. A number of years ago, I looked at state spending, and I was trying to come up with some sort of a formula that calculated the amount of regulatory power that the states had. And so I looked at certain categories of employees at the state level using the Census Bureau's Census of Governments, which is a thing, right? It's over 100 years old, fascinating document, looks at how state and local governments spend their money, how they raise the money, what types of employees they have, et cetera. And when you look at this, you see pretty big variances around the country as far as how much money states put into regulatory oversight. In the case of California, when I was still a California state assemblyman, I think there was, as I recall, this bill was passed in 2005 or 6 by a moderate Democrat named Juan Arambula. His son is in the legislature now. I'm not a big thing into dynasties, but his son is in now. So Juan Arambula was able to pass, and Schwarzenegger signed, this bill that said, show us the compliance costs of California's regulatory regime. Now, the report was done, and then the rumor has it that the Schwarzenegger administration was so embarrassed about that they embargoed their own report. They didn't release it, and we had to demand it because the legislature paid for it, right? So finally, we get this report released around 2008, as I recall. The cost for a small business to comply with California only, this is not federal regulation, California regulation, was about $132,500 a year. And of course, if you don't comply with those regulations, what happens? You get fined, and if you don't pay the fine, what happens? You go to jail, right? So you have the force of government behind you or against you if you don't comply. Well, how many people could you hire for $135,000 a year? How much capital investment could you make to grow your small business? And that's, of course, one of the reasons why California has been losing population for the last 3 years in a row.
To states like Texas.
To states like Texas,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yeah. Chuck DeVore, thank you for your leadership on so many of these issues. So many great examples you shared with us in this conversation today. And I really do hope that our viewers heed your advice and get involved and take action in their local communities. Can you tell them how they can support the work of TPPF and what you're doing?
We can be seen at texaspolicy.com, and I'm on Twitter. X at Chuck DeVore is my handle, and pretty active. But yeah, texaspolicy.com, and you'll see a lot of things, including a lot of really interesting white papers, some of which I've authored. So
excellent. Well, Chuck DeVore, thank you for being with the Daily Signal.
Thank you.